Hello and welcome on this very warm evening to the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum. My name is Erin McCluskey. I'm the Public Education Manager here at the museum. And I'm very pleased to welcome tonight, which will be a really wonderful program on collecting and personal ephemera and scrapbooks. Sort of a wonderful history of the art of collecting and scrapbooking. Our two speakers tonight are excellent sort of experts in this field. They've themselves have worked on a number of exhibits and books, including the beautiful book over there on the table, Scrapbooks in American History by Jessica Helfand. I'd like to formally introduce our speakers, tell you a little bit more about who you'll be hearing from tonight. Rebecca Johnson Melvin is an associate librarian at the Hugh Morris Library at the University of Delaware, where she is the coordinator of manuscripts in the Special Collections Department. The library regularly hosts exhibits both on-site and on their website, which I encourage you to check out. In 1997, Rebecca curated an exhibition and catalog titled Self-Works, Diaries, Scrapbooks, and Other Autobiographical Efforts. Library is a beautiful collection of scrapbooks and other sort of personal ephemera, which is where a lot of this tonight's talk will be coming from. So it's really very exciting to see that. Jessica Helfand is a graphic designer, a partner at Winterhouse, and a founding editor of Design Observer. She is senior critic at Yale University School of Art and has written several books on graphic design and cultural criticism. She is the author, as I mentioned, of Scrapbooks in American History and other books on design and visual theory, and has been a contributing editor and columnist for Print, ID, and I magazine, as well as numerous other national publications. Please join me in welcoming Jessica and Rebecca.
Thank you all for coming and for giving up watching American Idol. I'm very thrilled to be here with my friend Rebecca, who was very helpful to me when I was writing my book. And I'm going to take you pretty briskly through a bit of the process I went through to write the book and what I discovered along the way. It all began with Design Observer, which is a blog I started with my husband, William Drentel, Michael Beirut at Pentagram, and Rick Poynter, who's a design critic in London, in 2003. And shortly after I started the blog, I was walking in one of the big box stores that sell art supplies known as Michael's Arts and Crafts, which you can find in most American cities. And I had what my friend Ellen Lupton, who's a curator here at the museum, called a sort of epiphany. She said once that when she walks into Michael's Arts and Crafts, she walks in with a mixture of revulsion and longing. And that was sort of the feeling I had, particularly going through the scrapbook section, which was the size of a small football stadium. And I was really sort of stunned by the fact that I'd grown up in a family of collectors. I'd grown up knowing about ephemera and valuing its richness and being really interested, since I was a graduate student at Yale, in scrapbooks and photo albums and diaries and all sorts of sort of autobiographical kinds of things, biographical kinds of things. And here was this entire industry surrounded by and supporting a kind of making and buying and not reproducing and not really making sense of your own life, but really trying to embellish your life based on supplies. It's really an overstatement in the interest of time, but suffice it to say that I wrote this somewhat critical piece on Design Observer, and 185 comments later, these scrapbookers were very upset because all the graphic designers had gotten on board and called them crapbookers, which is not really the way to ingratiate yourself to a group of people who are scrapbooking enthusiasts. And I realized I'd hit a nerve, and I decided to write a book. And really what the book is about is about the kinds of scrapbooks people kept 100 years ago. And people from all walks of life kept scrapbooks, not just women. It was not a gendered activity. Men, women, tall, short, fat, thin, gay, straight, black, white, everybody kept them. And they were, I think, and I've really come to find they remain incredibly vivid testaments to life that no longer exists. First person, not vetted, very personal, very idiosyncratic, and I think therein lies their incredible beauty. So let me just do my little disclaimer here, so if anybody wants to leave, they know I'm not going to show scrapbooks that look like this. There were many scrapbooks kept at the end of the 19th century that were filled with pretty pictures and chromolithography, which was a relatively recent thing in the world. People were just excited. One day they opened their newspaper and there were colored things in the newspaper, and so they saved those. And so there are many, many things that are single subject scrapbooks. I'll speak a little bit of those that are a little more interesting to me, but I'm not going to show pictures of chromolithography. I'm not really going to talk about the Martha Stewart aisle at This is actually, I took with my stealth iPhone camera at a Michael's Arts and Crafts, even though it really is a sociological study for someone to do just the amount of stuff and what it's called and what it looks like and the kind of enabling notion of helping people be creative. I had to show this, though, just for an instant, even though I'm not going to talk about this. The book is about American scrapbooks. It's the frame of time that I looked at was about 1870 to about 1945, a very rich time of great change, 2 world wars, but only in America, because if I went to Europe, I would never finish the book. I would sit, as I was telling Rebecca earlier, in the library at the Victoria and Albert Museum for the rest of my natural life. This is a scrapbook that was recently published in Spain, made by a man who lived at the very end of the 19th century into the 30s. And this past week in El País, which is the largest newspaper in Spain, they ran a very interesting article about it and him, and that little inset color picture is from my book, and I was interviewed for it. So I'm beginning to see a glimpse of possibility that there might be some further chapter down the road for me in looking at these things. But for now, I'm just going to talk about the 2,000 scrapbooks I looked through in the course of doing research, of which there are 400 photographs in my book of the ones that I chose to include. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that people a generation ago didn't just save paper things. They saved dance cards, often like this one. When you went to a dance, you would sign up for dances. This ensured that you wouldn't be a wallflower. You could open these books and see the names of the dances, the foxtrot and the waltz, and things that, of course, are not commonplace anymore. You would see the little pencil on a silk thread, and people would caption around them and write about who they danced with and who was the fraternity and what they did and so forth. People saved coonskin caps. This was a scrapbook kept by 2 maiden aunties for their nephew. And their brother was called Eddie, and the nephew was called Eddie, so the book is called A Tale of Two Eddies. And they saved things like their brother's report cards and then the little boy's report cards. And so they started to build up, it was sort of an inverse family tree, where they started to build up a relevant history to this little boy based on what his father had done, but was much more timely and in keeping with his own accomplishments. People kept those red things there are firecrackers. And on the cover of my book, there's a giant key, which is actually the motel room key from the poet Anne Sexton's wedding night. And she was 19, she eloped, and she had this one gloriously happy, goofy, newlywed year where she saved Campbell's soup recipes and firecrackers that looked just like this. Her scrapbook is at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. So I included this one because it's a very similar kind of thing. There's also twigs there. It's worth pointing out, and several of my slides tonight will show this, that Scotch tape wasn't invented till about 1928. So people used paper and glue and bandages and chewing gum and photo corners inverted and under sort of taken apart, anything they could to actually create sort of emergency adhesive. Wedding books like this one were very common and included things like all the fabrics from the bride's trousseau. And what's so interesting to me about these books, this is from 1915 from Marietta, Georgia. This young woman got married, and her father was a senator, a Democratic senator from the state. And she was just considered this, it was the great social event of the season. And she was not a great beauty. She was rather zoftig. She was not so photogenic, but it was incredible. And she had, at the end of this book, there are, I think, 19 pages of wedding gifts, single space, all the crystal and all that, and things that people don't give anymore, bonbon dishes and candelabra and things. But she saved all the fabrics from her dresses, and because the book was closed for so many years, you open it and you see colors that are very hard to find in contemporary textiles and fabrics. So there are all these sort of incidents that you see that are redolent, I think, of a kind of social history that no longer exists. This is a scrapbook of stains and their antidotes. Beautifully positioned. Again, one of the things that draws me, I'm a graphic designer, and one of the things that draws me to scrapbooks is the fact that people like this, who are not visual the way I consider myself to be, felt compelled for whatever reason to keep these remarkably visual records of their lives. So rather than just write down, this is how you get out ink, she would actually put in the stains and sort of forward to a page like a Joseph Beuys composition, this extremely rational, beautiful, modern composition. This scrapbook is from a woman. Now, this is typical of women in the 1920s would go to parties and save their party favors. Often there were things like, this is actually a paper garter and a little umbrella. If you remember flagpole sitting in the 20s, it was very common to go to parties in those days and have to do stunts. And so you would have to do a somersault, whistle Dixie, kiss the guy on your right, and then eat your canapé. So they would save all the sort of evidence of these things. But the wonderful thing opposite this that I loved is that these are all photo booth pictures of this young African-American woman in Ohio in the 30s with her friends in a phone booth with a phone. So this was like the iPhone of their generation. The thing is like this big. And they schlepped this thing into the photo booth, and they're all sitting there with this like enormous thing. So they're just sort of these lovely, clumsy moments. And similarly, there are secrets. And I've been asked on many interviews during the course of my press tour on this book, what is the difference between scrapbooks and diaries? And there are many, and it's a longer conversation. But I will say that I think in general, scrapbooks were meant to be more public because they tend to be happy, goofy, visual, messy things. But every once in a while, there are secrets. This scrapbook has nothing in it but this page. And it is basically a sort of memorial to a tryst. There's a hotel, their names aren't really named, there's a toothpick, and inside there's, dried flowers inside on the back of the envelope. And so sometimes, this is one example, and there are many, like, why would a person with a scrapbook paste a love letter in with the addressee side down? It wouldn't be in your scrapbook if it wasn't to you. And yet they would do this, and people had funny acronyms for each other and funny little abbreviations. And so there are these little moments along the way that I think are secretive. This is something from one of Rebecca's scrapbooks, and she may want to jump in and say more. But this is the only scrapbook that I wrote about in my book that was not an American person. This is a Welsh writer, a sort of pulp novelist writer, who had these marvelous scrapbooks in Europe in the 20s and 30s. But in this one, she saved a clipping of a woman who spent years as a man who was caught and revealed she was getting married to another woman. She was revealed to be a man. And she wrote in the margins, "I would go give so much to know the real story." And what's great about this woman's scrapbook is that she used what was going on in her life as fodder for her novels. And so later on, I remember Rebecca sent me something while I was working on the book. I needed more evidence of her insanity. There was a whole scene where she had gone to Vienna and she'd gone to dinner with the Viennese ambassador, and as she's walking up the stairs and she's talking about the carpet and how fluffy the carpet was, and then she meets this man and he has a fluffy mustache and it looks like the carpet, and suddenly she's off and writing a scene for one of her novels. And it's just so ridiculously great that somebody would use their scrapbook as a kind of moving canvas through which to gather all this material and use it, in her case, for profit. Another sort of interesting, not quite secret, but to me very kind of illustration of the embryonic nature of people's lives are moments like this. This is a woman who saved, adjacent to each other, a picture of Adolphe Menjou in a Hollywood embrace next to a picture of Barnum's Animal Crackers. Similarly, this is a woman who saved a prayer card from church next to a picture of Rudy Valentino. And here you've got, like, I'm a good girl, I'm a bad girl. I'm a young girl, I'm a grown-up girl. I'm not really sure I like cookies, but I'd really like to kiss Adolphe Menjou, and I'm going to put them both next to each other in my scrapbook. So the graphic designer in me says, one makes a decision, a choice, a judgment. An editorial conceit prevails at some point when you make, not to these people, not at all. They just did what came to them in the moment that came to them. And that's where they become such genuine, I think, reflections of people's lives. Typography is something that, as a graphic designer, I will walk through quickly, but the kind of ransom-style nature of certain scrapbooks, particularly the ones kept by men, where they would save kind of beautiful examples of handwriting. They would save pages like this that were just of calling cards. And here again, the sociologist in you, if you're a historian and a visual person, you look at the names. I mean, people have these names like, what do we have here? Well, we don't have anything weird here, but the women's names are, they're all named Pearl and Bertha and Florence. Bertha and Florence were the two most popular names for girls in 1900. And calling card etiquette is a thing unto itself. That's quite interesting. A woman, for example, would never put her address on the calling card because that was shown to be not the thing women did, whereas men could do that, different typefaces, different kinds of things. But, young kids in school would have pages and pages in their scrapbooks just of calling cards. And so you get a sense of so this is, the example. Let's see if I can go backward here. So that's a man's scrapbook. This is a woman's scrapbook. I'm not generalizing, but I'm just saying that often you would see a much more sort of florid gestural displays of visual form. These are just beautiful examples. Somebody made this kind of patchwork quilt of handwriting exercises back in the days when there were penmanship primers in school. And then equally secretive, in a different kind of codified language, were hieroglyphs, which in the case of scouting books, I see very, very frequently. This is from 1915, the Campfire Girls of Lenape, New Jersey. who, very much in the kind of as a precursor to Girl Scouts and the badges and the things they did. They didn't have to write about who said what to whom. They would just color in these little hieroglyphic reminders of what they did. And now another thing that I love is what people leave out. And in some cases, what people leave out is very neat. This was an old Marm school teacher from Maine. I actually acquired her scrapbook from a vernacular photography dealer who included her obituary in the front. So I knew actually quite a bit about her, which is rare to know a lot about the person whose scrapbook you've acquired. But she traveled, and that was the one thing she did besides be a school teacher in Camden, Maine. And so she created these beautiful, sort of very thoughtful, considered compositions of where she went. Even the way she ripped the paper is consistent and considered. But this, from another one of Rebecca's books, was a woman named Teresa Vallée, who was involved in a very sensationalized divorce and custody battle in the very end of the 19th century in New York City. Both parties accused the other of infidelity, and in particular the custody battle was very drawn out and very publicized in the papers. And one of the things that she does in what is still a pretty classical, almost Victorian model of a scrapbook is she saves calling cards from people who were important in town, who she can then, it's not clear whether she did or not, but the scrapbook could have been used as evidence in court, as many scrapbooks were in cases of infidelity, to show this is a love letter I received from so-and-so. In her case, she saved letters. In this case, she saved a letter, she ripped it up, and she put it back in the envelope. Or she saved things that would show that she was actually in the right and that she should get custody. And I use it as an example in my book to show one of the first modern examples of the self-made visual, where here's this woman, and you can literally, when you go through these books, and they're extremely analog, they demand enormous persistence and patience. But when you start to understand psychologically the profile of the person who just fastidiously saved, pasted in, took out, wanted you to know this is who she was, you start to see this woman kind of coming unraveled and wanting very much to keep up appearances for the court, her family, her public. And I thought that was quite interesting because you don't see the same kind of random, gestural, unruly madness in scrapbooks in the 19th century that you see at the beginning of the 20th. Similarly, publishers started to get wind of the fact that people wanted to make notations in their books that had kind of rubrics and compartments and categories within which they could place their life, very much like a diary would be today. And there are baby books, I'll talk about those in a moment. There were publishers who sort of jumped on the bandwagon of creating these kind of pre-sanctioned memory books in which you could say, I did this on Thursday, I'll do that next Tuesday, I'll save this, I'll save that. And what I love were when people said, to hell with it, I'm just going to put pictures here. And as you go through time, you see that the sort of vernacular language of scrapbooks changes. In the case of a publisher, for example, in the 1920s, would make a memory book for young girls. Young girls would go to parties and it would say spreads and entertainments. Well, at a certain point, I found all these books in the 30s where people would just cross out spreads and entertainments and write parties. It's called parties. I don't go to spreads and I don't do stunts and flagpole sitting anymore. So the books remained the same, and they tended to change a little bit less, with less rapidity than the people who used them. I had to include this just because I don't know why I had to include this. This is a catalog of caskets onto which somebody posted really off-color racist jokes. Now, there is a lot of this out there. Like, why? The whole repurposing of books, geometry textbooks, phone books, wonderful big books that came out of things like Sears and Roebuck and Swatch books. And people would just rip them apart and use them. Like, why anybody would use a casket book, let alone to put off-color jokes in it? So sometimes the juxtapositions that we were looking at before that were charming, like the prayer card next to Rudy Valentino, get really strange. And there's really a lot of this in scrapbook making. Something that is, I think, also you started to see more of as the new century, I'm talking about the last century, of course, the 20th century wore on, were people being more daring in their willingness to address a page and what the page could look like and what the page could encompass. I found very little evidence. I'm going to show this one, which is a girl from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who cut out all the pictures of her teachers and stuck them on these wonderful little things in her scrapbook. She's the same one that, well, we'll see her in a minute. She's the same one who cut and pasted everything and made it a big origami mess. This is a scrapbook from Rebecca's collection in Delaware, again, where somebody cut out the face of a guy and partnered it with a flag. I saw very little evidence of this between about 1870 and 1910. And you know, there's no question that the people whose scrapbooks I'm looking at here, who are in Iowa and Delaware and Ohio and California, were nowhere near the Armory show in 1913 to see Cubism making a splashy appearance and understanding that the picture plane could be something they could play with. And yet, you see real evidence that by the teens, 20s, during the First War especially, and after, people start really getting experimental. At the same time, they're you know, reading more, they're learning more, the world is changing rapidly, and many of them are using their scrapbooks like, this is the girl who decapitated her teachers. This is the same page in her scrapbook. Here it is closed, and here it is open. Here's my little animation. Here we go. Animation. Everybody awake? Yeah. Okay, moving on. So I said I wasn't going to show themed scrapbooks of chromolithographs, but here are just some I couldn't do without. The dog book, that is, as you might imagine, all about one person's dog. One person's dog. Yeah. It's like page after page. This is the death book. Now, there's facsimiles of this available on eBay, but I actually have found 2 copies of different ones. So this was a thing people did. This is 1894 in Ohio, and this is a person who on the pages of a geometry textbook saved every macabre, horrifying murder announcement that appeared anywhere in the tri-state area near where he lived. And there are things like, you know, seared him with a hot poker, you know, 2 weeks with a corpse. A senile mother lives alone with her body of her daughter after she dies. One after the other. And, you know, as you go through the book, you see these equations jumping through from the geometry textbook. But it's this very linear, rigorous alignment of these, you know, horrible, horrible things. And it was a Victorian pastime. Jumping ahead to the 1940s and 50s, a very frequent pastime was keeping tabs on guys, if you were a girl. I have not found the equivalent on guys keeping tabs of girls, but the hymn book, and these are 2 examples, and there are more. From this day on, I'll keep complete a record of all the boys I meet. We call this in my studio the stalker book, because you could actually write down his nickname is, I met him at, he seems to be terrified of me. This is before you could get like restraining orders on people he lives at. And it's actually, you can't really tell this, but it's encased in wood. That's actually wood, balsa wood. It's quite beautiful. School books, I have hundreds of them, and they're all called different things. My fellow schoolmates, my chums, alma mater days, happy days at schools. Many, many books that were aimed at students. And in tandem with that were, as we come up on the heels of Mother's Day, mother books, and then I'll talk briefly about Army books. But motherhood is a particular case in point, and I speak as a mother. That, you know, you have your first child and you get one of these books and you're sure that every time the baby coughs you're going to write it down, and you make it into like the 2nd day and you're totally sleep deprived, and that's it. However, this was not always the case, but it was mostly the case. I found many, many baby books, beautiful books with pictures, and everybody had locks of hair and nannies holding babies. And then you get into weird ones. So this is my absolute favorite, enabling the mother who is clearly just annihilated any capacity for reason because her hormonal imbalance is at such a state that she needs a book to tell her what to save. So this is the Dee's Blessed Events scrapbook for babies that was published in 1942. Now, I don't know if you can tell on the slide, but this is a little half page with these little characters that are introduced called Scoopy and Scrappy. And Scoopy is the journalist, and Scrappy is the art director. And Scoopy and Scrappy tell you how to lay out a page. Well, as a graphic designer, I mean, I didn't even have to be doing a book on scrapbooks. I loved this. I could not get enough of this. So here, you know, he's an old hand at pasting things up. And literally, there are pages in this that tell you to save pictures of appliances on the day your baby was born. Now, it's true that, you know, the older I get, the more likely it is that my children will think it's funny that, you know, there were no iPhones when I was born. But anyway, it's just ridiculous, and this is my favorite page. This is Scoopy and Scrappy doing layout. Arrange clippings on page like this, because maybe you wouldn't know. The one mother, I think, in the history of all mothers who deserves our either admiration or pity is the mother of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who he was born in I think, 1895 in St. Louis. And of course, you could imagine books looked like this in 1895, and this was the page for progressive photographs. So it says at 1 year, at 3 years, at majority. So that's the picture of young F. Scott Fitzgerald shortly after he graduated from Princeton. This book had a very unusual page, which was a page on which, from the time of 5 until maturity, you were asked to bring your child back to the book for his signature. And she did it. every year from the time he was 5 till the time he was 21, shedding rather a light on one bond between a mother and her child, which is kind of horrifying, but really beautiful, because you can't, I mean, the graphic designer in me, again, loves the fact that you can see the maturing handwriting, but kind of an amazing record that the document would actually persist for so many years. In war, you would think that scrapbooks would become important, as they were, and there's evidence, and I'm not the first to say this, but there's evidence that in time of war, we become more fastidious journalists. We care more about what we write, what we save, what we say, and I think it probably has something to do, in no short supply, with the vulnerability that we feel in the wake of war and loss. And this probably explains why scrapbooking supplies as an industry have surged since 9/11 in America. But during World War II, and it goes back to the Civil War, and a colleague of Rebecca's and mine wrote a wonderful essay about the sort of antebellum notion of carpe diem, which means seize the day, which is a very scrapbooking thing. But in World War II, they get kind of goofy. They were scrapbooks that were marketed to the families of soldiers, where you were meant to actually keep a record of what was going on while your brother, husband, son was overseas. And there were scrapbooks that were marketed to soldiers. And some of them were very poignant. War heroes, you were meant to keep, things like that, and then you were meant to keep things like that. So the scrapbook became a thing that if you were a soldier going away and you didn't have your sweetheart to bring with you, you might bring a little material. And then this scrapbook that is also from the war, and I actually found this on an auction on eBay, and someone had tried to revive it during the Vietnam War. It was very sad, because my first, second, third contact with the enemy. I mean, war is war, and the kinds of things you would want to make a record of don't really change. In World War I, however, before women had the right to vote, there were scrapbooking volunteers. And America's entry into war came late, and it was brief, and there was a lot of bloodshed, and the kinds of scrapbooks that were available were much less goofy and gimmicky than things like the buddy book. Now, you can't see this, but maybe from afar you can at least appreciate the fact that there was some forlorn art director somewhere who actually had to worry about those 3 colors and making those pages look so magnificent. The cover page is presented to the soldier. It says, on the up top left, it says, "My shirt, my date, my razor, my socks." Now, I thought it was kind of weird that you would actually care about your socks, but I guess having clean socks was important. So that's the thing about scrapbooks. We collect what's important, but I thought that was sort of a charming thing, that you would worry about your socks on the page of your scrapbook. Which suggests that men kept scrapbooks, which they did. As I said earlier, it was not a gendered activity. Mark Twain created a self-pasting scrapbook that he patented in 1872. It is alleged, though it may be apocryphal, that he made more money from the patent than from all of the fiction he ever published combined. I actually saw the patent application when I was doing research for the book, and he wrote this very long, not tongue-in-cheek, completely serious appeal saying that the reason his self-pasting scrapbook, which really was just gummed pages that you wet and you could then adhere things to, the reason it was such a boon to families across America was that on Sunday morning, when you went looking for your paste pot, or your mucilage as it was called, when you went looking for it and you couldn't find it and you started swearing like a sailor at the top of your lungs, this was a terrible thing for children to hear. But if you bought his scrapbook, blasphemy would be eliminated from the world and it would be a good thing. So he made a lot of money. This is a scrapbook from Rebecca's collection from a man who took a world grand tour in the early part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century rather, and beautiful, beautiful examples of receipts from Moorish lace he bought, and he bought a helmet in Gibraltar, and tickets, and menus, and all sorts of things. No handwriting. Very kind of removed from any kind of one person's emotional state of mind during this great trip. And the reason I included it in my book was that I researched this man after I found this book, and found that he came back from the trip, divorced his wife of 20 years, married Miss St. Louis of 1922, moved to the south of France, had 2 children, and then she murdered him in their hotel room in Cannes, shot him, I think, 3 times in the neck, and was later acquitted by a jury of 7 bachelors. So Time magazine in the 1930s reported on this thing like every 5 minutes, and she was beautiful, and there were all these scenes of her on the ship with the children coming back saying, "Don't hate me because I'm beautiful," and oh, by the way, her husband had been Jewish, and this was during a period of great anti-Semitism in France. And the epilogue to my little tale here is that when I wrote this in my manuscript, I sent it to my editor, And I wrote something to the effect of, it's amazing to look at this visual document of such richness and see it as a reflection of a man's life that clearly there was so much going on in it, but he was devoid of any sentimentality. And my patrician, wonderful Yale editor writes in his beautiful handwriting in the margin, how do you know he didn't come back every night to his cabin on the ship and cry like a baby? And it was like so great, and it was one of the many things that happened to me during the course of this book, where I say in my epilogue to the book that you can't think you know anybody. All of this is conjecture. I tried not to be prurient. I tried not to be exploitative in any way. But you do, as a forensic analyst might, try to put the pieces together. As a visual person, try to make some coherent statement out of what these people were. And I did think it was kind of interesting that this guy kept this amazing scrapbook and had this life that is not in the scrapbook. This is a typical scrapbook from a college boy, where instead of saving flowers and paper garters, he saved a lot of football stuff. And this is a scrapbook from a man who was a Philippine immigrant who put himself through medical school in Seattle in the 1940s. And it weighs 22 pounds, this thing. It is so beautiful. And what you can tell is that he would clip things out. That brown paper there's clipped out of a newspaper. And the rest is typewriter written. And you couldn't tell whether he wasn't, whether it was Xerox machines. You couldn't tell whether he actually was adding his own editorial companionable or non-companionable text, or whether he was so interested in this writer that he copied it himself. But what he did also was he stamped every page with his name. It's a rubber stamp in the lower right. And he drew these magnificent borders around each page. There was clearly a graphic designer in him struggling to get out. This is an example of a series of, I think, over 20 books in Rebecca's collection that was started by a man on his 70th birthday, I think. He was a poet who kept what he called self-books, self-works?
Books. Yeah.
Self-books. Yeah. And Rebecca will talk about that in a moment. And this is an example of a mistake I made. This is Stan Brakhage, the experimental filmmaker, whose papers are all at the University of Colorado, but whose 3 magnificent scrapbooks actually went to Yale. And I literally was about to ship the book when I realized he hadn't kept the scrapbooks his wife had. And it was a wonderful story. It was the only person I interviewed for the book where I was able to trace her and talk to her. And she wrote about being a mother of 5 and an artist and having no money, and this filmmaker husband. And he would literally leave the studio at the end of the day, and she would truly, it was the cutting room floor, she would go and she would find these vestiges of his life and their life, children's drawings, letters, postcards, and she would weave together these stories, and 3 huge, I mean literally huge books of them. And it was this very sort of poignant story to me that she, again, much like people in the earlier part of the century, used her scrapbook as a kind of roving canvas to make sense of her world. They're really, really beautiful pages, and in some ways informed by his work, if you know anything about Brakhage's work, but still very much her own. Okay, one last anecdote, and then we're going to move to Rebecca. This is my favorite scrapbook in my collection. I wrote about it last summer for the New York Times. Some of you may have seen, I did an illustrated op-ed for them telling the story of the stunt book and the woman who kept it, whose name was Eleanor Moses. Again, we talked about flagpole sitting and stunts. She was a fun-loving, pretty California debutante. She went to parties. Every single one of these magnificent dance cards has a monogrammed, letterpressed, engraved thing from a different fraternity. Everybody loved her. This is 1919. She went to the Marlborough School for Girls. You have pages like this in which are the following episode. You got 3 calling cards, a filled-in dance card, a rose that's been flattened and dried, and then on the back of what is a coaster from the Hotel Virginia in Long Beach, which is as Gatsby-esque a place as I think ever existed, in a handwriting that is not Eleanor's, probably her suitor, maybe one of the men on the page, maybe not. It says, "What Eleanor ate for dinner, July 6th, 1920. Half a cocktail, 3 olives, all my chicken salad, 4 cherries." So you get this picture of this girl having a drink, and it's the summer, and she's rich, and she's beautiful. Okay, so you think you know her. Wrong. This is episode number 1 that actually happened 3 weeks before the date that I just showed you. Her cousin's getting married. Her father lives in this beautiful mansion in Hancock Park in LA. The bridal party's all there wearing diamonds, as it turns out, and they're having a rehearsal dinner, I guess, the night before the wedding, and in come 3 people through the windows who grab all the diamonds and pearl necklaces off the bridesmaids and shoot the bride's brother in the neck. He lives. The wedding takes place the next day at the bedside in the hospital of, and it's all over the papers, and so that's the bride in the oval, and there she's getting married in the sketch. This appears in the LA Times the next day. 3 weeks later, she's at the Hotel Long Beach eating chicken salad and cherries. So, you know, this is this wonderful, she's sort of part of this incredible scandal. She's a known family, and she's still going to dances and parties. And literally, she has entries in her scrapbook that say, you know, this is what I had for dinner. I had a shampoo today. Isn't life wonderful? Then, halfway through her book, I find a stack of envelopes from the Pacific Coast Division of the Fatherless Children of France. Turns out, she's raised over, I think, blanking, several thousands of dollars, which was a lot of money in those days, for a high school girl, to support these fatherless children in France during World War I. And one of them, she adopts in that way that you know, in that feed the children way you adopt a child, you support a family. And she got this beautiful series of letters back from the girl's mother. She sent money to this family. It was a mother with 3 young daughters, no father, and Eleanor Moses sent them money every month. And that was the little girl. Her name was Juliette Galigné. And it showed me that this person who I thought I knew, who kept this miraculous scrapbook of all this ephemera, turned out to not be the party girl I thought, but actually had a really remarkably beautiful character. And that, in the end, is, I think, what resonates about my book for people. It certainly did for me, which is that the humanity you see in people, as evidenced through the scrapbooks they kept behind, does not date. And it really links us in a very humbling way to all that came before us and hopefully what comes after. Thank you very much.
So I do have a script. I'm used to a little bit of a different setting, but we'll move on here. I do want to say I'm just thrilled to be here. It's a real honor. I just love this museum. I've been here many times. And design is so important in all of our lives, and it's certainly an important way we can look at scrapbooks, and certainly Jessica's picked up on that with her work. It's a major part of what I do with the material I work with as a manuscripts librarian in special collections at the University of Delaware Library. So maybe some of you are familiar with the Winterthur program in Delaware and why in Delaware, the university, we would have many complementary collections and program interests from wallpaper pattern books to agents' sample books for 19th century calling cards. There's a lot of content we have overlapping with the Winterthur programs, and we often trade visiting scholars. My own library's strength, obviously, in design is the book arts and works on paper, typography and printing and binding, handmade and decorated papers, all the contents of the book culture. Though design is equally the focus of products that might be in our collection of historic trade catalogs or any of our vast collection of materials related to the decorative arts, our fine press collections, and broadsides and posters. And I really do enjoy being a manuscripts librarian. There's such a wide variety of materials that I get to work with. Our department has a book unit, public services, and the manuscripts unit. So kind of by default, I'm involved with all of them, but especially the non-print materials. That's all of our graphic collections, prints, photographs, media. In some ways, it's a lot of the problem material, and that's one way that scrapbooks have always been considered. Manuscripts and archival collections encompass just such a variety of material, as shown in this gallery exhibit, where we use all types of material in any of our interpretations. And I'm going to skip around the ages, just mention some genre types, not just documents and works on paper, not your ordinary correspondence or manuscripts, but maps we deal with, graphics, illustrations, photographs from all processes, from daguerreotypes all the way up to inkjet prints. Of course, the diaries, journals, the bound format. We have galleys. There's electronic media from the 5 1/4-inch floppies on up to DVD and beta, old things, vellum. But it's the commonplaces, the scrapbooks. These words that I'm using, I just want to throw them at you to emphasize their genre types. That's the library lingo. It's a format of material. So by and large, our reference and outreach that we do for manuscript collections supports contextual use of all these genres. What did the poet Elizabeth Bishop say in a letter of a certain date, for example, when she sent that letter to John Malcolm Brennan? It's part of my job to promote use of the collections, and it's easy enough when there's obvious context to the question being asked. It's a little bit more challenging. What I'm trying to do is emphasize a new genre, a new context, a way of looking for information. And so as Pat Buckler, my friend who's an English professor of rhetoric, says in this quote, there are opposing values even in this word. The idea of something, a scrap that's meant to be impermanent and you throw it away, versus the noble book, the container of this permanent, enduring information. And I think Jessica will admit and agree that there's something appealing to us in this scrapbook genre about this ambiguity of what's in there and whether or not it's real knowledge or information. It is to many of us. Now, there's a philosopher in library science who I admire greatly, S.R. Ranganathan, and he was an Indian mathematician. He was born in 1892. He was also a librarian, and he gave us these 5 laws. And so I'll paraphrase this overview, which is that the good of the book is to be read. But as a manuscripts librarian, I like to put it that the good of the archives are to be used. And so that's why I am so fond of Jessica Helfand. Because I not only appreciate that she tackled this genre head on, and she really used the heck out of it when she came to visit us, but in the 20 years that I've been a manuscript librarian, she's really one of the most efficient researchers I've ever met. And from what I sense, it's because she has this gut instinctive response to the scrapbook as this visual genre. She sensed the compelling challenge to synthesize design and the meaning of all the scraps of information that are compiled in infinitely individual ways in so many different volumes. And rather than getting stuck on the individual stories to be deciphered from one particular volume, she's taken the pulse of a genre and measured a vibrant form of expression in our American culture. There's another book, it's fairly recent too, and not to give you competition, but I want to acknowledge there's wider interest in scrapbooks. This one, edited by Tucker, Ott, and Buckler, provides a history of the genre, and then it includes 7 essays that are about the use of scrapbooks for learning and knowing, and then there's 8 more essays that are about representative books of the self, including one essay that I wrote about a family scrapbook. But Jessica's book is the first one with an overarching narrative and a probing view of this genre and all its vibrant nature. And as a graphic designer, she has the acute skills with visual literacy as well as understanding of graphic communication and popular culture. So she came to our library and she used trucks of scrapbooks in our reading rooms, and she was able to ignore all the brown chips of paper that break apart and intimidate so many other users. And she was able to absorb the details of so many scrapbooks and form impressions of their makers, and the result is that engaging book, which succeeds in connecting us, the readers, with so many real American lives and past times. And it's chock full of ephemera, colorful bits and pieces of everyday living that were never meant to survive. These scrapbooks evoke the lives as much as they tell the stories. So, though I work largely with textual sources in a book, in the library, I do believe in this visual literacy, even when what you see are reassembled pieces of text. And scrapbooks really are the ultimate challenge, I think, for researchers. How do you put all this randomly eclectic pieces of paper that have been collected within and find the context? Or are all these things simply lost code? Will people ever get it? Scrapbooks are hard to ignore, and they're certainly overlooked as a genre in my profession. When I was co-chair of Manuscripts and Other Formats Discussion Group, which is an American Libraries Association specialty group, I put scrapbooks on one of our agenda discussions one time, and to begin with, people just have this reaction to the physical condition. It's such an obstacle to librarians. They too easily focus on this. Preservation challenges and the problems of housing all these broken bindings. This is certainly, you know, an ironic title for a 19th century scrapbook. And then true also, catalogers amongst us face description problems because so often these are untitled books, they're undated, they're by anonymous or unknown, and these volumes loiter as problems in our collection backlogs. Yet these are the kind of challenges that I feel like excited Jessica as a researcher, and they certainly intrigue me as a manuscripts librarian. And I want to note the archival principle of provenance, which is behind my support for this genre. Every scrapbook has provenance. Somebody, someone, at some time collected and they created and they compiled these materials. They put the content together. Roland Barthes challenges us to read cultural through non-literary text and to enlarge our notion of text. In an Aperture magazine preview of the work she was doing for the book, Jessica described how the scrapbook thrives on this insider knowledge and outsider art, and how we're challenged to read between this personal sentiment and the public space. So the tobacco scrap from the title slide that I gave you, for example, is a piece of garbage that I found in the library someday. But I had this personal reaction. I immediately recognized it as a cigarette, Blue Seal, and it took me back to Winston-Salem where I went to college, and the sweet smell of tobacco in the fields, and it reminded me of the bad habit I had then, which I have no longer, of smoking unfiltered Camels. And that's somehow you read into these pieces of things that you respond to and put in your scrapbooks. Now, my own appreciation of scrapbooks does date back to curating the exhibit that was mentioned earlier. This was in 1997 at the University of Delaware. And I was going to feature diaries and journals from across our collections to promote access to those sources as genre within our collections. And as I called the titles, one of my favorite selections was this 9-volume set of Jessie Southard Parker's journals, which I realized they were more of a hybrid scrapbook journal. She was an upper middle class woman, a suburban housewife from Belmont outside of Boston, and she created at least 9 of the volumes. We have the ones that date from 1897 to 1916. And at one point she noted she was making these to entertain her daughter, but she had in fact actually started them before her daughter was born. She pasted photographs and maps and postcards and the kind of party favors that you were talking about, and programs and handbills and Christmas gift shopping lists and news clippings. Anything colorful was included, along with the journaling part, the descriptions and the observations and her opinions about everything. So there's glimpses of her occupation or at home as a domestic, running the family, her family generational life, her social circle, her community, her entertainment circles, and the world. She did clip news events from around the world. She kept a running list of comments about the books she was reading, and comments such as the one shown here when she saw in 1915 Birth of the Nation, D.W. Griffith's historic film that was based on Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. This, I think, represents the extraordinary research value that you can find in the contemporary commentary of people living their lives. She loved music, theater, entertainments, so her scrapbooks are just beautiful. They really provide a rich look at what was popular and accessible to people with her economic liberties, her social status, and her proximity to entertainment in the Boston area. So I mulled over Parker's books, and I also, as I was curating the exhibit, reading broadly about diaries and memoirs and autobiographies, and the broad field of life writing. And then I remembered the scrapbooks that we have of the Irish poet Brian Coffey, and I gave them a much closer look than I'd ever given before. He died in 1995. He was a poet, a philosopher. He was a math teacher, a translator, an artist, and a publisher. And he had found his intellectual path in the company of fellow Irish expatriates in Paris in the early 1930s, along with Dennis Devlin, another poet, and Thomas McGreevy, and Sam Beckett. They all studied under Jacques Maritain. This was an important part of his life. That's him in the front, down in the lower corner with the head of curly hair. Now, over extended periods in his life, he created crazy, bulging scrapbooks, many of which he called his self-books. And these were related to his creative projects, but I also realized that most of them truly could be read as autobiography. I think the story of who he was. There's a lot about family and friends, and there's letters tucked in from his colleagues. They were bulging with surrealistically juxtaposed clippings, reflecting a peculiar sense of humor about all the dim news in the world. They were full of words and images, some of them extracted, some of them original, and they all related to his time and his life, what was of interest to him, anything and everything. These are visually engaging books. They're loaded with ways to read about his life and to understand his creative influences. So he actually called them his self-books. And in a nod to him, I decided to call my exhibit Self-Works, Diaries, Scrapbooks, and Other Autobiographical Efforts in honor of this varied, rich genre. So since then, I've been an advocate for scrapbooks and different ways to look at them. I've talked to different types of groups, students at the university, public groups, professional groups of archivists and librarians, and also interdisciplinary audiences. Some of the men's scrapbooks that I looked at in selecting for Self-Works gave me an opportunity to contrast and mull over the differences between men's scrapbooks and women's. And because it's often hard to find women's sources of so-called ordinary lives, I really appreciate the content of a lot of these scrapbooks. And it was a bit of a daring thing, but sometimes you do this when you want to draw attention to a topic. But I gave a talk to archivists in 2001, and I called it Engendering Scrapbooks, and I good-naturedly claimed that women made better, more visually appealing scrapbooks than men, because it was so easy to find scrapbooks of men with public lives whose accomplishments in sports, media, and politics are just so dryly documented in volumes of press clippings. But ironically, I learned and began to realize these were often compiled by the wives, secretaries, and commercial services. But it really wasn't hard to find the more colorful, complexly structured scrapbooks that were made by women about their lives and their activities, and to compare these to the men and make my point in that presentation. For example, this is the Teresa Vielle, the 1871 divorcee, and she used this to document 2 volumes, a really personal crisis, this high society profile divorce from her husband who'd been a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. But the exception to this gender argument, of course, took me back to Brian Coffey. And I readily admit there's many, many more men I've found whose books are of interest and visually appealing. And there's certainly women who kept dry, straightforward scrapbooks too. But it was a fun session, and it was a good lesson later to just think and go back to the emphasis for me on the public versus the private content of the scrapbooks rather than who made them. So I have found plenty of men, such as John Hill Martin. He was a Philadelphia attorney who collected all kinds of family records, such as this clipping that's about election of a family member to the Pennsylvania General Assembly, or family land indenture that he cut up and he pasted into his album. His 1-volume scrapbook is a really complex history of his family. He pasted original documents into it, and he also copied out Bible records and other pieces of information to substantiate the births and the deaths and the marriages of his family, which was scattered throughout Delaware and Pennsylvania. And overall, he's got 167 bits and pieces of individuals represented in this single volume. And I want to say something about content and context and description. So I assigned this single volume to a processor in our department, and at a first glance, he didn't know what to make out of it. So I just asked him to consider the questions, the obvious questions. Who was the creator? Who put this scrapbook together? And what does it document? And what can you look at inside and find out where he went and what he did? And was he important when he got there? And what types of material are in this scrapbook? And how is it organized, if at all? And at what point in his life did he create this scrapbook? So upon turning the fragile leaves, the processor discovered that there actually were recognizable chapters or segments in that book, series, if you will, into which Auchincloss organized his life and he summarized his career. There's such a wide variety of documentary evidence in scrapbooks. Theatrical companies document their tours, fans collect press clippings about actors and actresses and popular entertainers. My sister has a scrapbook about the Beatles, that one comes to mind. Or we have working groups and organizations who document historical projects, such as this 1915 Red Cross sanitary commission that went to Serbia in the beginning of the Great War to eradicate disease. Travel is by default a state of heightened observation as one contrasts and compares everything that's gloriously beautiful and different from the comfort of home, as in this volume here. And literary lives are common fodder, as in the case with Mark Harris's scrapbook, which was related to publication of his first novel. And as Jessica started out, we can't have a talk about scrapbooks without mentioning those 19th century technological advances in color printing, specifically those chromolithographs, candy wrappers, and cigarette cards and trade cards, all those pieces of ephemera, the true scraps that were issued as collectibles. Many of these were printed to be collected and placed into the die-cut pages of trade-specific albums, which are, of course, they're now highly treasured and collected today. Children and youth and women were definitely the targeted market for scrap collecting and scrapbook making in the 19th century. But inspection of the stationer's catalogs reveals all kinds of blank books that were being sold. And as we've seen, all kinds of people were filling them. And this, I'm glad Jessica has such a good example, a wide variety of the types of commercially available blank books, the life events of graduation and babies and weddings, war and funeral that have been produced and prompted people to fill them. Some of these have really been behind sustaining this scrapbook culture in America. I think it's important, though, in looking at scrapbooks to see them as a progression of the record types that are related to much earlier commonplaces, the copybooks, the autograph albums, the recipe books, receipt books, and friendship books. A collection that I love to show related to this is the Littell family papers, which includes an outstanding collection of multi-generational commonplaces and copybooks and scrapbooks that were handed down and clearly treasured by family members. They were the family heirlooms. So the extant books that we have date back to the remarkable Morris sisters from Germantown outside of Philadelphia, Margaretta Hare, Elizabeth Carrington, and Susan Sophia Morris. She was the only one of the three sisters who married. All were born just at or before the turn of the 19th century. Margaretta died mid-century, Elizabeth died in 1865, and Susan Sophia died in 1868. The verse that I'm showing here in the front of Elizabeth Carrington Morris's 1829 album reflects the feminine sphere and the sensibility that cultivated 19th century albums as keepsakes and waiting for future heirs to discover the sentimental shreds and patches, the small objects, as well as the love letters and the murdered meter, if the maker was a blue, in that last line, as in a blue stocking. So this tradition of commonplaces, the Morris sisters recorded useful information, such as you see here, scraps and bits of pieces of information. Elizabeth and Margaretta achieved recognition in their own lifetimes as scientists, demonstrating knowledge they gained through studying and painting birds and insects and plants that they found in the backyard garden of their Germantown home. Elizabeth contributed articles to the American Agriculturalist, and Margaretta is credited with discovering the 17-year cicada, and she was invited to become a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Commonplaces and copybooks in this family collection reflect the contributions of friends and other family members over several generations, and they showcase the calligraphy and the penmanship. They've got original and copied verse. You see the albums begin to include laid-in pieces, such as this botanical, and you also see the beginnings of the cut verses that were pasted into the albums. Then you have engraved and hand-colored plates that were pasted in with greater frequency in the later volumes, and these are the ones that the historians, we can ask them to consider. How were the albums used for education or intellectual development? Where did these young women gain such sophisticated reading tastes? As book culture, how do the albums support study of the history of reading? Where did the cut pieces come from? From print culture, how did the illustration processes change? And do these changes represent greater distribution of illustrated weekly and other materials and other publications? Now the next generation, the descendants of Susan Sophia Morris Littell, kept scrapbooks that are in the more practical vein, taking notes about European painting during a tour abroad, for example. Though there's still the opportunity to consider the maker and wonder about this private person who kept these pedantic exercises. Did Mary Littell in 1901, for example, you can imagine her starched collar, really relate to this relaxed reader here. Granddaughter Jeannie Morris Littell Winslow created scrapbooks too, as with this album in the 1930s when she went to see her uncle, who was the Bishop of Hawaii. And her scrapbook was a place to keep souvenirs like postcards, and she cut out pictures from travel brochures. But the amazing thing about her project is that she organized and indexed all this collected information. From the earliest 19th century scrapbooks, where children kept ABC scrap sets or animals or pictures of costumes from around the world, scrapbooks have been these educational tools. They're ways to organize and categorize and arrange aesthetically all bits and pieces of information. So the work in Jeannie's scrapbook is really amazing. And she kept it to keep these customs and traditions in her mind. They obviously made a great impression on her as a visitor. And she even kept it as a place to preserve the ultimate memento of her trip, a lei. You find lots of these botanical specimens laid in. So let me head towards the end here, and I'm going to go back to Brian Coffey. In 2006, I was on a session about scrapbooks at the Popular Culture Association, and Coffey's books still intrigued me. So what I decided to do for that presentation was look at them as scrapbooks as creative workspace, the self-books of Brian Coffey. Beyond the autobiographical content, it's clear that he used these as workspace. He kept drafts and notes and first copies of his poetry. And I found numerous examples of him using the books to collect impressions, snapping worldviews with a personal twist, which he used for his artwork and sketches and drawings. He sketched out things, he planned projects. Here you have this forlorn figure on the left who appeared in one of his dry point etchings later on, shown on the right. We've got notes and drafts of an important poem that he published, The Death of Hector. That's the outline on the left and drafts of the poetry on the right. He also, in the same space, collected classical images, which he apparently used to communicate his vision for the illustrations that were done by the master printer S.W. Hayter in this fine press collaboration of the Death of Hector. So I've only been giving you glimpses of such a variety and all kinds of fascinating scrapbooks in our collections. Now, anticipating future editions, I can't help but add a few comments, and maybe our discussion will go somewhere about scrapbooks that are being made today. Jessica's book and the other recent ones, and certainly all kinds of articles and popular culture material, barely touches on the true phenomenon, economic and cultural, of scrapbooks in our American culture today. The Smithsonian had this festival in 2006 at the Museum of American History, and Jessica was one of the participants talking about her work in progress at the time. The event included educational lectures and information that was practical about preserving family scrapbooks, and they had this clever outreach activity where they had these neat scraps scattered around the museum so that people could pick up the pieces as mementos from their visit that day. And there was a family activity table on the lower level where people could make scrapbook pages and take them home with them. And they also had the American History Museum archives open that day, so people could see hands-on the rich variety, the types of scrapbooks that Jessica showed you. So what about the real contemporary ones, the croppers? I think we can be amazed at the content of scrapbooks from any generation, as in reaction to this page from memoirist Stephanie Klein's Year at a Fat Camp. From the magic pages that you can see those adhesive lines in that page, I would date this one from the early 1970s, and I would add it to our collections in a minute. But who else is making these scrapbooks today? In addition to the historians, I've really touched on this, Jessica's already mentioned, archivists, the historians, the book artists, sociologists are really interested in this culture, and they've contacted us to find out more about the community of the contemporary croppers. Now, who are the croppers? They're addicted to memories. The interesting thing culturally is they often convene in groups at these events called crops. And that's a word that I'm assuming does mean this practice of cutting and cropping the images for insertion into scrapbooks. And from what I've observed, and I feel like this is a fair gender generalization, that most of the contemporary croppers in these certainly internet world of meetup groups are women, and much of what they're making does document the family and the feminine sphere of their world. There is a humongous business, big business, in the scrapbook world. Again, Jessica's touched on that. It's interesting, it's often tied to fundraising or self-business for young women or mothers that sell scrapbook supplies on the side. There's an industry publication that cited a $3 billion industry last year. Any craft store sells all this material. It is overwhelming to notice what's available. They host the workshops. They also have these retreats where people can actually go away and do this all weekend long. And I once gave a talk to a group at a crop. It was a fundraiser. And it looked a lot like this. Tables set up, people sitting around doing this activity together. There were vendor tables. People were selling this material. And I certainly want to acknowledge that this crafting sort of aspect has always been a part of making scrapbooks. But because the vendors sell this type of material, I want to raise a caution flag about the look and the content of how so much of what's made today might start to look alike, but maybe not. If croppers buy this stuff, are the albums all the same? One reason to talk about scrapbooks in a historic sense is to raise this awareness about the individual, the personal narratives, and the interests these things still hold for us, and to encourage that continuing individualization and the personalization that goes into these works. Many scrapbook makers run the risk, and they've been asked, what's the difference between what you're doing and the glorified photo album? And in fact, there's a little bit of stall in the scrapbook supply industry right now because of the growth of the custom digital photography album. That's sort of moving people in that direction. But again, I think that you can look in the past and see lots of kind of boring, look the same, but it's the information that carries forward. Each day's ephemera will have a new look to the people and the time and the personal look that you put together, so that the ephemera and the photo montage, as well as the cutout stick-on things, are endlessly put together in creative and unique ways. And I've spoken to all kinds of groups. I've spoken to senior citizens about life writing. I've spoken to brownie groups about memory books. I've spoken to conservation students about the problems of these. And it's really enjoyable. It's wonderful being in this forum. I really respect the enthusiasm, this new enthusiasm that Jessica's brought to this historic thing. So thank you.
Thank you both. That was really wonderful. When I neglected to mention, when I gave the introduction before, you might have noticed that we're actually filming this event tonight. It will be available on our website, as are all of our public programs, at videos.cooperhewitt.org. We're also doing an audio recording, which will be available through WNYC as part of their Talk to Me series of podcasts. So as we answer questions, just if you could just wait until Jess or myself comes to you with the microphone, that would be great, so we're able to capture all the questions as well. So we're ready for questions.
Yes, young man.
I'm curious if you can speak to the notion as researcher or reader as voyeur, and specifically if you can tie it back to Stan Brakhage, who I have a huge thing for, whose own work could be literally interpreted as scrapbook on celluloid, like, but just the notion of voyeurism in your role as totally third party, nothing to do with these family or people in their lives.
To whom are you directing this question?
Both. As an archivist and as a researcher, right?
That could be one of the most enjoyable parts about being a manuscripts librarian and archivist, is reading other people's mail, you know, seeing details of lives. But it's the thing about primary source material, and particularly visual content, is you're able to read on a different level and sense details of lives. And I think any researcher who gets into a biography or a historical thing, that's a good researcher who's looking and trying to understand it. I mean, that's part of doing the work.
When I shopped my book around, one of the things that my editor said to me was that this book couldn't have been written 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that in the history world there's now a newfound interest and appreciation for first-person histories. And that obviously if you take them cumulatively, you have a more vetted history than if you look at them individually. And I think that what Rebecca's saying is so true, that you start to look over time at the differences and the similarities. I've had many people ask me the question, did I feel I was a voyeur? Did I feel I was telling tales that should not be told? And I don't know that I went into the project being concerned about that, but I did feel at a certain point very responsible and almost related to these people. Like I'd adopted suddenly all these grandparents. And I loved my grandparents, and I don't have them anymore. So, you know, I think that maybe I'm at an age where I adopt people, and it's probably my own weird affliction, but it was a very respectful kind of view I had of things. But at the same time, to bring back Brakhage into your question, when he made Mothlight, which was this great little 3-minute film he made in the early 60s, he had no money. And basically what he did is he took packing tape and he caught bugs on tape, but he used the tape the way you would a camera. He used the tape the way you would a scrapbook. It was really using a very simple medium and method through which to document something that happened in an instant. The film is all of 3 minutes long. And as you point out later on, he just went right into the celluloid, and just the film stills from Mothlight are magnificent. And I think that I went back and forth, as I do in everything I do, between being a maker and a writer. So I was, you know, I would get completely involved in some visual thing and then have to pull back as the writer, critic, forensic analyst, archivist, go to someone else to sort of talk through the stories. And it took a long time. And it really, you have to kind of let it percolate and try to sit back and say, well, what's really going on here? But I think Rebecca's right. That's kind of the beauty of it. You can't, one of the things I love about scrapbooks is that when you read a biography, it's usually organized chronologically. We tend to read obituaries. He was born, he did this, he did that, and then he died. Scrapbooks are so asynchronous. They're so nonlinear. And it makes you realize that the chronology of life is the ebbs and flows of life. And sociologists, as Rebecca points out, have called this, have referred to photo albums in particular as being very good at documenting what they call episodic time that leapfrogs from birthday to celebration to happy event. Scrapbooks are a little different in the sense that you have other stuff. Ephemera is forgettable, it's throwaway. So it doesn't have the same kind of celebratory focus. So you really have to be very patient and persistent and go through and make sense of it. And I'm sure I was a voyeur at some times, but hopefully not too prurient in my interest.
I was just wondering how you go about finding new pieces to acquire into the collection. And also, I know your research only went to 1945, but what year do the scrapbooks in your collection go up until?
I put a cap on 1945 because I thought things got really boring once television entered the living room. And people's imaginations just became less about, you know, if I live in the country, so I'm in the car a lot, and I have a great love for radio. And I think one of the great things that radio does is you're driving and you form your own pictures for what goes with the wonderful words. And I think that in a way scrapbooks were like that. People didn't have the media saturation we have today, and they didn't have the video saturation we have today, and therefore they had to come up with their own composite renditions of the world. So that was really the cap for me, and also I had to end it somewhere. So
we have ongoing relationships with donors. Occasionally we purchase scrapbooks. The price of these things has gone up, but I still find them at yard sales or something that then I'll pay $8 for, you know, a scrapbook of automobiles, and it's, yeah. And this one recent was a gift today from my sister, who had bought one for research advertising business for the Cunard line. It was a historic scrapbook of a woman who'd taken a tour, and she kept all this, you know, photographs and notes and the menus and the ship events, and so there's this experience of traveling on the Cunard line, and that's great research content for people who are interested in style and travel. We have people that like to use that type of thing. It's one of the reasons I've talked to different types of groups is to be an advocate for, you know, yeah, it's keep your organization, keep a scrapbook, fill it with stuff, or to talk to kids and say, this is a fun thing to do, it's a wholesome thing. It is interesting to see movies. Start to pay attention in movies and remember the occasions when scrapbooks are part of the story, or there's a scrapbook in the older movies, and it was a part of people's lives. They were doing it. Helps it tell the story sometime.
Hi, this question's for Jessica. I'm curious as to whether writing this book has influenced your perception of contemporary scrapbooking. If so, how? And if you could just kind of parse out some of the similarities and differences you may see, you know, what practices of meaning and value may continue and what has been diluted?
It's an excellent question, and I touched on this briefly. I think that in times of difficulty, people keep scrapbooks because it reminds us that it's a concrete gesture. I'm pasting a thing in a book, and you know, after 9/11, perfect example. I'm increased vulnerability. I'm going to do this very simple thing, but paper, form. I was here. I did this. I think that gesture is extremely valuable and probably timeless. I think the similarity may end there. And I think also that I had one very contentious interview in Salon in which I talked about going to a crop in which I noticed not only were they all women in their pajamas all weekend, but there was a lot of junk food, and it was in our studio, we called it Twinkie Gate. I was like, you know, just hundreds of days of comments of just these women ready to just, I mean, I was boycotted on Amazon for a day. It was really bad. But in fact, I was sort of not, I was the wonderful writer at Salon, kind of took it out of context. My point actually to contemporary scrapbookers is a very simple one, and it is this. It is that your life is not the same as my life, it's the same as the life of the person next to you. It can't be. And where graphic design and ephemera intersect your life is where the genuine you occurs if you want to keep a scrapbook, and that shouldn't cost anything. So I advocate a kind of what I call green scrapbooking, which is sit down at the end of the day and grab what's on the kitchen table, take what's in your pocket and your wallet, make sense of it, build it out from there. And my one little anecdote to illustrate this is that this morning I had a call from an editor at Oprah magazine. A little review of my book is appearing in the June issue of Oprah magazine, and I had told this story about being in my studio a few months ago when I have this big studio that's 30 feet high, and bugs get stuck up there, and this dragonfly was circulating for what must have been months, and I was talking to one of my designers, and it fell right on the table. And we all sort of stood there, and then we looked at it, and it was really beautiful. And it was a sort of moment of rigor mortis when, you know, wings are usually in motion, and there was this moment when the wings weren't moving, and I went and I grabbed Stan Brakhage-worthy packing tape and I taped it into my scrapbook. And we sat there and we looked at it. And Bill, my partner, was just, like, God, designers, I'm losing so much time. We have work to do. But it was this incredibly beautiful moment. And it was silly, but it was beautiful. And it was a funny story to tell my children. And I still have that picture, that wonderful flattened wing of that dragonfly. Well, for some reason, the editors of Oprah magazine thought this was the greatest thing ever. And so I had to go scan it as I was running down here to give this letter. I had to scan the dragonfly to send to Oprah magazine. And I was really happy that they were interested in that. It's a silly example, but in a way it's a wonderful example because something else would happen at your house and something else would happen next week. And I think that what I learned in the process of writing this book was that there was no self-consciousness, really. They spelled things wrong, they tore things out, they ripped things up, they were who they were. I have a scrapbook of a young woman who was clearly always late. And she didn't want me to know this now, 90 years later, but in 1910, every single thing for Kitty in the scrapbook said, Kitty, could you please be on time? Could you please? The party's at 9, show up at 8:15, just come on time for once. And in the scrapbook, she saved a pocket watch that somebody gave her, and she saved it, and she glued it, taped it next to the card that said, Kitty's always late. It seems to be her fate. So here's a little watch to help her keep her date. And here she is, basically a celebration of her Achilles heel. That's the sort of tenderness and reality that I learned from these people and from their scrapbooks. And I think I don't want to put all the scrapbooking mom and pop shops out of business. And I buy some of this stuff, back to Ellen Lupton's comment. I think some of these supplies are beautiful. I just think that it's not, I call it a sort of meaningless visual grammar in my book. Because if you try so hard to be like everybody else, why would you bother?
A lot of the contemporary ones are very flat. They don't have as many things in them. And those bits and pieces are so engaging. When you go into the older scrapbooks, they're just fascinating things that people put in. They're the true found things, and that's makes them really fun. And there is a very healthy debate always about what goes on in the scrapbook world. And I read a comment recently, why I hate scrapbooks, by someone who was actually making them, but she realized everyone was cutting out the photographs and putting the picture of just like the face. And she said, they're really taking, I caught on to this because she says, they're removing the context. She said, when I grew up, the pictures that my mother took of the house that I never remember living in are so important to me because I can see what the wallpaper looked like and the details. And I thought that was kind of an interesting comment that there's, there was, people often do that. They create this kind of collage. Although it's one of the crossover things that I love about scrapbooks is it is a crossover with the collage medium and activity. I think that's really lots of fun.
Oh. This question is for both of you. I wonder if you've already both begun to touch on this topic, but can you speak a little bit more directly about what it is you think that scrapbooks convey visually that books don't do, that textual books don't do?
That's a tough question. What do you think?
Well, part of it is the immediate connection to an individual that put this stuff in there. That's someone else's extracted view and the individual, so that I don't know, I think a good author does that in print too with a good story, but just the visual content, and there is text and things to react to. There's a lot going on there. I
think many scrapbookers use the visual matter as their cue to respond, and sometimes the response is very brief, and sometimes the response is very long. I mean, I didn't go through all of Jessie Parker's scrapbooks, but there was one in which she talked about going to a restaurant and the waiter being surprised that they didn't want wine, and she was a Christian Scientist, and this being a sort of expression of her temperance, but she thought it was really funny, and it's this beautifully written passage that I don't really know anything about Christian Science or temperance or what it was like to go to a restaurant in that year, and yet I was also really interested in the fact that she was from this very elevated social class. She lives in Boston. 1912 comes and goes, and she never mentions the sinking of the Titanic, which probably claimed people of her own privileged class that she might have known. So that's where the omission gets in. And so I think that, it's everything. It's you start to know the person, but then they bring you back by showing you something that they saved. So I have to say, probably, for me, that's one of the reasons why the just chrome lithographs or just clippings aren't as interesting. because it's when people responded to things. And it's very easy to respond to something visual. It's a cue, I think.
Excuse me, when was your book published, first published?
My book?
Yeah.
The day before the election, November 3rd of this year. I guess that's last year.
I have two questions. One is if you went home and started getting creative and saving things of different volume, like a watch, and you put it into a book, how do you best preserve something that's very clunky and very uneven, as well as what's the best, you know, do you have to be careful of tape that's going to wear out over the years? And so how do you preserve it? And that's the
You
first.
should ask the preservationist this, but as a maker person, there's a funny little Moleskine sponsored a show of scrapbooks and gave notebooks to 13 designers and artists. And it's now an exhibit this week at the Salon dei Mobili in Milan. And they said for us to document a week in our life. And I wanted to save stuff because I thought it was so great that all these people saved stuff. And I was cleaning out my studio, so I saved an example of it, something I ate every night for dinner, like little piece of spaghetti. And I got glassine envelopes that are archival. Archival being the name of the game. You can get archival tape now, you can get archival glue, everything. 100 years ago, nothing was archival. And I personally love the yellow things that Rebecca's showing. I mean, to me, that's part of the patina of age that makes it so beautiful. But in fact, now you can. So my quick answer would be all kinds of envelopes and things. And Candy Jernigan, I should say, who's featured in my book, who was married to Philip Glass, and she was a graphic designer and an artist who died way too young, was the biggest influence on me in terms of making scrapbooks of anybody, because she traveled with one. And it was no longer go back to your house and put something down on paper and get it right. It was put this thing in your bag and find a toothpick and find a thing. And she would sit there on airplanes and just put these things together. And she had systems, being a graphic designer, and one of her systems was glassine envelopes. Always travel with a date stamp. Always travel with glass, you know, certain. And I thought, wow, I could do that. And I travel all the time, and I get really frustrated when I'm away from my studio. And it really, and I'm now on my 5th notebook since writing this book. And it's great because when you travel with it, you don't. It's about the moment. It's a much more immediate gestural part of you. But you should speak to the archiving part.
Well, that's part of the big business, I think, of the whole field is marketing archival. And, you know, you have to be really careful, I think, in paying all that money for a lot of stuff that sometimes isn't archival. But it's true, you should always sort of be aware of the quality of the paper, the adhesive or binding property that you use. As you've seen, like, people put things in the days before the cellulose tape with everything, including straight pins, and those botanical specimens in that 1930s, you know, that stuff's in there and it's still there. But so one of the cautions that I tell people about preserving these overall is there's actually a great level of protection in the fact that they're in the book. They're not loosed and lost. And the closed book is protecting it from the environment, and then it's there for you to open. And if you feel you need to put it within a box, then that's another layer that's protecting it from the environment, because the harm is going to come from the light and the changing fluctuations of heat and humidity. So those are like really simple things that you can tell people. It's like basic bottom line preservation tips that anybody can do. It is just kind of protect once you put it in there. Once you've put something in the scrapbook, it's protected on a certain level already. So I like to say that's an economical advice to give people. But, you know, there is this thing that you put this in a book and it makes it something you can share. It's wonderful to get it out.
And then I have a second question, because it strikes me, working on some marketing Facebook, working a marketing project that includes Facebook, about how the idea of the scrapbook has been consolidated into a site like that.
Yeah.
And how people really do pull from different elements as far as photograph, videos, snippets of what's going on that day that are dated. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that, and also whether you see, because it struck me contrasting the site to your talk, about how there's almost a bit of loss of the love of history, because everything is so immediate, quick, and has a very short shelf life on something like Facebook.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, certainly the people that are looking for old boyfriends on Facebook would say it's all about history. And I have a lot of friends who are looking for old flames on Facebook. So, but you're right. I think the big difference, of course, is that unless you take screenshots of every time you change your status update, how do you preserve that? I'm actually quite intrigued with the irony. If you're somebody who has a lot of photographs sitting in shoeboxes at your house, and suddenly you realize you can put everything on Flickr, it's probably safer on Flickr. It's probably going to last longer. I mean, it's true that the digital sort of way of parsing it out to some third-party place where it lives in that infinite real estate known as the internet, there's something kind of safe, and you've exiled it to microfiche in a way that it's still retrievable. It's just not, you just don't hold it. It doesn't have the same kind of, doesn't smell like anything. So I don't know. I think that people will find some, I think it's yet to come, whatever that hybridized form is. Because I think Facebook is great, and every time I speak to undergrads at Yale, you know, that's exactly what they say. Why would I do that? I have Facebook, I have MySpace, I have my own website, I have texting, and yet all of those things just go. They just fleet into the netherworld. It's not yours anymore. It's not yours anymore. But people of a certain generation tell me, and there was a wonderful piece in the Times about this weekend, that, you know, it ages you to say that you care about sharing or privacy, and those kinds of things are really, you know, really kind of call you out as the fuddy-duddy you truly are, that we all share today, that's what we do.
Well, it is interesting to compare and contrast. I mean, I certainly see the similarities of their scraps and all these different things that you can put in there. And another great similarity is that hypertextual going back and forth, and the non-linear scrapbook that you can go in and out of bits and pieces of information. So it's just a different media, and I think we've seen media change historically over time. It's just something to think about, how to preserve it and capture it. We're certainly dealing with that.
In the scrapbooking community, I should just add that there's detractors even within it, and some of the young scrapbookers who are doing digital scrapbooking are referred to as indie scrapbookers.
We have time for a few more questions. I have a question more about the commercial aspect. You showed a few things back in perhaps the 40s or 30s about women who were sort of too busy to do their own baby, the memories about babies. The commercial industry had sort of laid it all out for them. And when I go into a Joann's or I go into a Michael's, I'm both sort of clutching my pearls and, you know, wide-eyed at the same moment. And I think what I look back in the 20s and 30s and 40s that's quite commercial and a bit kind of propaganda-y, to me now seems rather quaint and cute. But I think, okay, so what are the things that we're producing right now that 100 years from now will look quaint and cute? What are the basic commonalities between what was quite commercial in the 20s and what is quite commercial now that will be charming 100 years from now?
Well, for one thing, I love when I see ticket stubs because you see what things cost. You know, I was at the Smithsonian a few weeks ago, and somebody went to see Isadora Duncan had box seats in 1909. It was $24, which was a lot of money in 1909. But usually it's the opposite. Usually you see it's 17 cents or something. But I rarely see examples, and I get these magazines, people send me this stuff. I rarely see examples today of people saving tickets or saving movie ads or saving the kinds of things that show what things cost, or menus. I mean, food was huge in scrapbooks, and Southerners, you know, it was all, the biscuits were mighty fine, and they'll like tell you everything they ate, or they'll save the menus, and what people ate, you know, cold consomme and, you know, mint pillow, you know, marshmallow things. I mean, and if you ever see prices, it's 15 cents for a bowl of soup. I never see that now. And yet I think that's, I don't know if I'm interpreting your question correctly in terms of quaint, but I think there's something so genuine about that which we now look back and we see social history. We see what Birth of the Nation was when it was first out. What did it mean to go see that in a movie theater? What did it mean to go see Enrico Caruso, who she loved, this Jessie Parker? I mean, what did it mean to actually participate in popular culture as it was before mediated popular culture? So I worry that we don't save those things today. The contemporary scrappers cut out faces without the context. That everything is. One other thing I worry about today is that the standard norm for contemporary scrapbooking is a square. Really hard format for anybody to. I mean, I went to graduate school at Yale with all these old Swiss guys teaching me graphic design, and I spent years, I wrote my thesis on the square. It is the hardest format for anybody, and here are these people who have no design. So they're just making it so hard for themselves. And it's a very neutral surface. That's why game boards are square, so that everybody has an even chance to win. I mean, there's a reason why a square is Swiss. It's neutral. It's very hard to do anything dynamic on a square. Even people that know how to work with a square, it's very hard to do. So, it's a very curious world, and I'm curious about it, I think, more than critical, and although I've gone down in history as being very critical, but I didn't say scrapbooker. My readers of Design Observer said scrapbooker. So I think that it's a very noble art form that should continue forever. I just wish it had more genuine stuff in it.
I think if you save things today and look at them next year, they're going to look quaint and unusual because, change only accelerates. But for historians and all the different kinds of researchers that we have in almost any subject, it's all these little details of life at any given time. It is a snapshot that you're able to sense. And one of the things that's wonderful about women's scrapbooks is a lot of women through history may not have been famous or doing certain things. Certainly many women were famous in doing things. But understanding ordinary lives, you can look at scrapbooks as evidence, recipe books, what were they cooking? It's like little details from your daily lives are of great interest in the future at some point.
I love these scrapbooks because they are like personality profiles. And as you know, I collect snapshots. And the reason I was drawn to collecting snapshots was because they were something so precious and edited and saved. And one of the things about people's photography now, it's what was the one picture that meant something, because I've taken probably 80 today with this. Yeah. So have you seen any particularly well-edited what's the most wonderful contemporary personal scrapbook that you all have come across?
That's very hard to say, but you're raising a good question about appraisal, because at some point there's going to be this question of how much stuff can you collect and what can you save. And that's why I kind of make a case for the individualism in the work is like, how do you put it together, or what are those details that you're putting together to tell a story that makes it unusual? Because, over and over, the trip to Disney World in a scrap album that was created at a crop that has the same background paper that the other person used, it just is not that unique or telling. So it's sort of that aesthetic eye in evaluating your photography. You might have a whole bunch of pictures of just knowing that's the one. That's why you had the contact sheets, so you could select the one you wanted to print. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a good question that's relevant to design overall. In our work tables and our drafts of any projects, you do a lot of practicing and whatever, but then you know which ones you want to save. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are so many, I couldn't say which one's a favorite at all, because they're engaging in lots of different ways. They tell me different things about different people. Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, thank you both again.
Thanks for having us here.
Thank you very much.